Welcome to my webinar. My name's Jamie Hepner. I'm an applied sports scientist here at Catapult. Today I want to talk about some custom parameters that we can create within the cloud, within your cloud account. I'm going to run through the process of how to create those custom parameters. I'm going to run through some ideas of some common or advanced ways to combine metrics and have a custom way of looking at them. But it should be used as a template if you guys have ideas around things you want to do in a custom setting. You should be able to apply the things we're going to talk about to make your own custom parameters. But if you ever have any questions or any ideas that you want help with, assistance in creating on your cloud accounts, please reach out to one of the applied sports scientists here. We're going to look at some absolute and relative custom measures, so some that take into account time and how and why that might be useful, as well as absolute metrics that can combine parameters or look at the totals for individuals as well as positions or the team. Also going to look at some stuff that might be specific to positions, different positions within any given sport. So predominantly the custom parameters are created on the cloud. So if you open your cloud account and go to settings and parameters here on the task on the left bar here, you can hit the list custom parameters. And there should be a few custom parameters that are in your account by default, depending on what sport and things like that you're involved with. And you can go in here to add custom parameter to create the custom parameter. We'll come back to that a bit later. So I want to run through some different ideas now on what some examples are, and then we'll get to creating those custom parameters on the cloud and how it's all done. So a first look at first idea that I want to run through here is really common for some indoor sports and can be really useful for indoor sports. Certainly useful in some applications for outdoor sports as well, that I'll run through a little bit later. But banded player load is a really good way of, I guess, quantifying or breaking down the different contributions to the total load of how that total load came to be a certain number. So if a player's got a 500 player load for a session, what was the breakdown of that player load on how it was contributed to that total. So for instance, a basketball I think is a really useful application for this type of parameter. If a basketball player has a 500 player load, in basketball we make the pretty safe assumption that of the lower portion of how that player load is made up, we can be pretty safely assuming that came from running events. Anything that happens in basketball that is a real significant event, like a contact event for a center, say jostling for position under the ring in the paint, running really fast and changing direction, landing from a large jump, they're all going to be significant events. And so the way player load measures it is it's that sort of instantaneous player load, all sort of contributing to this end figure. So we can band it and pretty safely say that all the lower bands come from running. So with that being said, we can break down the contribution of this load into groups. So a good starting point, as you can see here, is 0 to 0.7 is that sort of running or even maybe slow jogging. 0.7 to 2 is that sort of moderate intensity running, and then 2 to 4 is going to have some contribution potentially for other events, but it's going to be that really high speed running. It's going to be changing direction heavily, and some landing for jumps, and anything over 4 is going to be a really significant event on the mechanical load side of things, player load. So what we want to start to look at is, set the bands for these things, and of course have a look at the how much was in each band. But I think a really worthwhile approach to this is look at the percentage of the contribution to total player load, and that's where a custom parameter comes in. So we come into our custom parameter section that we went to before, and we obviously start with a name. So we can start by saying, let's say, player load band low percentage. So in the calculation, you have a few in terms of how we make up this custom parameter. It's very much like Excel and writing an equation, and it can be as simple or as complex as you want to make it. I find the best way to do it is just to start typing, and the system will help you. So we start with equals as we would in Excel. Start with a $sign to tell the system that we're looking for a parameter, and then we go ahead and search by our parameter. And we're generally going to be searching by this underneath name, and that's how we need to code essentially the parameter. So we want to look at player load band 1 total distance. And then we're going to say we want to divide that by total player load. Now, if you're looking to exactly type them out as they're coded, you need to use underscores, as you see the system did, but it's just as easy to type it in as you think about it, and you can click on it in the drop down list and it will use the right naming for that. When it glows blue, that generally means, or that means that you've done it correctly. If we type in something wrong, right, and type a typo like I've done there, it won't glow blue, and that means the parameter hasn't been allocated to the correct parameter. So when it's highlighted blue, that's a pretty good sign that then you've done things correctly. Just click on it and it'll glow blue. So in this case, all we want to do is take the player load value and divide it by total player load, and then we can go ahead and add parameter and it will create it. And it says custom parameter OK, custom parameter saved. So as you can see, now our player load band percentage is here as a parameter. And when we go into the cloud, to one of our widgets here, we can go into parameters and we should be able to search that. Player load band low percentage, as you can see, is right there. Or if you don't use the search function, it should be in your custom parameter section on the cloud. So creating one of those custom parameters for each of your player load bands to look at the percentage of player load that contributed from that band to the total player load, it can be very useful. And so looking at the raw numbers, it won't be in distance or anything like that, it'll be in player load figures. So that's why I think looking at a percentage of total player load can give you an idea of the breakdown of a session, and starting to understand where a certain player has a normal range for his contribution for certain running could be a really good idea of how intense he his practice was or his match was, and then understanding if that's changing as based on an injury risk. Because two players could have the same total player load. Let's say that two players had 500. If someone's contribution to that player load was much largely more intense in his player load contribution to the total versus someone who spent 90% of his time accruing player load at a low intensity, while the session was quite different for both of them, and the load for those two players should be assessed differently. So back to a little presentation here. Another example I have here is creating potentially an advanced metric that looks at a few different factors that we can measure, and it's taking in a few metrics that you may already be looking at and tries to assess more of a holistic one number approach. And different people are going to have different ideas on how this is made up, which is where a custom parameter can be really good, and I'll run you through my thought process of this one. We have certain things that we know to be more significant in terms of the mechanical load on a player, and therefore contributing to muscle damage or fatigue. So if we look at a player's IMA breakdown, we traditionally might look at the asymmetry between left and right and acceleration, deceleration. I think that can be very, very valuable. But another way we can potentially combine or break this down is combining different aspects of that to create a single number. So combining the total IMA movements, so the total explosive movements in the high range can be good. And then combining all the IMA events from low, medium and high can also be good. But we know that obviously the more intense movements will be more damaging and fatiguing. And we know that IMA is only reported as a count, so an event count. How many times did you do this? So giving a weighting to the more intense movements, the high IMA events, can be worthwhile. So combining all the total IMAs for high, maybe weighting them by 3 or 5 or whatever you think is valid. Weighting the medium events, you might do a 2, or you might say that no, we think medium is about a 1, that we want that to be the midpoint. And you could weight the low events. We say we still want them in there, but we want them devalued because they're going to be picked up as a lot of moderate. The low events are not going to be registered as general running, but the changes of direction, accelerations at a low to moderate pace. And of course, you can manipulate your bands and thresholds as what activates as an IMA count. But starting to load based on the intensity of the IMA count, and then we can weight it even further. If we're looking for a true loading measure, we certainly know that deceleration events can be more significant than other events, and that's of course due to the eccentric force that's more heavily present in, much more present in deceleration events. Of course, it's present in high velocity running as well. So if you're in an outdoor sport, you could combine some high velocity, whether it's counts or yardage travelled at those high velocities. Obviously, the ground reaction force involved in the foot strike has a good deal of eccentric force as well, so that could be combined as well. But we'll stick for the purpose of this webinar, we'll stick to the IMA. So let me run you through an example here. We go back to our settings, we go to parameters, list custom parameters. We might call this weighted loading, weighted IMA for the purpose of this. So we're going to write an equation here. Okay, so we're going to equal, open bracket, let's say for the purpose of this, and you can customize this as you see fit, we're going to weight the high IMA by 5. So I'm going to say by 5, open bracket, and this is going to be a high IMA bracket. So we're going to say $, IMA, band, we're going to say 3. Left count plus right count plus Excel D-cell and close both brackets. So as you can see there, we've got in the first, the main bracket there, we have just simply all the IMA counts added together, and we're going to weight that by 5. Then we're going to add the medium IMAs, and so that's going to once again pick your own number here, but let's say we weighted them by 2, and we can just go ahead, copy all these, make sure you place your brackets adequately, and we can just change these banding numbers. Once again, if it stays highlighted in blue, you've done the right thing. If you do a typo like that, it will just de-highlight itself, and that it's showing you that there's some error in the way you reported the parameter. Then we can go ahead and say plus this whole thing, paste it. We might say 0.5 for band 1. And so there you have it. All we do now is add parameter and save it. Now, of course, if we wanted to give a weighting, an extra weighting to the D-cell bands, we could just simply come in here, create a bracket. I usually use 2 brackets to be safe. Again, we're going to double the weighting. For those, and of course you do that for the subsequent deceleration parameters. So there you have it. It's just another idea, another thought process around how can we create a parameter that is more all-encompassing, that gives a greater weight to the things that we know are more significant. And you're going to be able to play around with these weighting figures and start to have a look. I encourage people to start to create a custom parameter that you have an idea about, and just start to look at it. All right, what does it show me? Okay, is it starting to correlate with some of the things that we know? We can see this player is starting to get fatigued, and does this custom parameter fall into line? And is it showing us something? And is it a real linear relationship or a really close correlation to a parameter we already have that may not be as detailed? Or is it starting to track away from those other parameters like total player load or total odometer, and give us a bit more of a detailed scope of fatigue or load on that player? Go back to the presentation here. So once again, if you've got ideas or questions around that, the creation of this sort of all-encompassing weighted parameter, and you don't have to use IMA, you can use velocity zones. I think you can certainly use player load bands if we want to do a weighting based on the banding that we spoke about just before. These are all ways, but I think the weighting idea of all these different intensities and things that may be more or less impactful on the load of a player is a good starting position. So please reach out if you have ideas or questions or things. We're more than happy to talk about it. So the next example I want to use is around a player-specific, position-specific. So within American football, we certainly have some metrics that we can measure for players whose major load is running, and that's your skilled players. Certainly, we can start to look at how far players go at high velocities. The accelerations can be maybe more useful for those big skill players who don't hit a high velocity, but they have a high load in terms of their low velocity, high acceleration, deceleration, these sorts of things. And if you're outside, GPS acceleration, deceleration can be fantastic because it gives an extra color than simply a count like an IMA does, and using both together can be great. But for a lineman does a lot of his work, a lot of his load in 2 or 3 steps or less sometimes. An offensive lineman may take 3 or 4 steps backwards or to the side for, let's say, an offensive tackle, but have a significant amount of load with that. So, slow concentric force, even if it's a real lockup, he's working hard in his upper body and his legs may be just working eccentrically. All these sorts of things that we really want to start to be able to quantify. And so the thought process behind this one is, all right, so if we have a wide receiver and he has a certain amount of yardage that or total player load that he sees week in, week out. If you have a game where you increase his running capacity or his running load by 50%, significant increase in the total yards he runs for a day, that can be a flag, and he might be a little sore and fatigued, but he will survive generally. If it's a once-off, he should be okay, unless something happens or he has some predisposition to injury, he'll probably survive that. Now, if you give him 40 more impacts than he's used to, you'll probably break him. He's not built for that sort of abuse, generally. Or he'll certainly be in a lot worse shape than if you simply increased his running load, because his bread and butter is running. Okay, you take an offensive guard and increase his impacts by double. Okay, he's going to be sore and he's gonna labour a bit, but he'll probably survive it because he's certainly used to the impact and the blocking and things like that. Now you give him 1,500 yards of running, now that'll probably hurt him a whole bunch more. So our flags for players are different. Now, yes, we can measure the distance a lineman travels, but a lot of his work is done in short proximity. So where I'm going with this is, with the same thought process in mind that we had for the player load banding earlier, we can look at a very similar capacity for these linemen. So what we want to see for linemen is generally repetitive, high player load contribution to their total player load. So a high percentage of their contribution to total player load comes from that high impact. Someone's crashing into them, or they're running into that player for a screen play or something like that. But we want to keep an eye on that low underlying murmuring along player load. So the stuff that's sort of under 2 player load threshold, because that's probably the things that repetitive, running, covering distance, that sort of stuff is going to be probably more of a flag than the really big stuff that we're going to see. Offensive linemen, even a defensive lineman, even on the outside, are probably rarely going to get up to any kind of velocity, even though a defensive end might accelerate and run hard. He will rarely run quickly. He will just have that high change of velocity. So this is what we want to see and start to quantify and start to have a ratio that even I like the thought of just a 50-50 ratio. So how much of the total player load was attributed over 2 player load threshold, and how much of it was under. And you'll start to get a feel, I think, for what's normal for your lineman. And if we start to really get out of that, start to really get away from what is normal as a percentage of the total player load, that can start to be a flag. If we're usually seeing 70% of the lineman's load coming from over 2, okay, well, that's good. Now we start to see that drop down to the 40% mark. Well, that can be a flag that he had a significant amount more of his total load came from running around. So that's simply done in the same way as we did the player load banding, just taking a band or even adding the 2 bands together in a bracket and dividing by the total player load, and starting to track a bit of a look for linemen and how their total player load is made up and where it came from. I won't do an example for that one. I think it's the same as the first one, but certainly if you have questions around that or even ideas that might improve that, please reach out. I'm more than happy to discuss that one. So, by the same token, a similar thought process and just reversed for the running players. Certainly, skill players, even starting to look at some big skill players as well for American football. But I've used this next one in Australian football, and I think it converts really well over to soccer. And it's just starting to understand. All right, we've got a reasonable idea, whether it's tested or estimated, the external velocity of anaerobic threshold. There's a bunch of different names, VVO2 or max aerobic speed. Or what we're just trying to say is, in a lot of ways, we can measure the internal point at which we tick over to, the athlete ticks over to that, the contribution of oxygen from your anaerobic energy system. And we want to quantify that as an external velocity as opposed to a percent of max heart rate. And so we can start to look at, all right, what is the velocity at which this point that we reach this threshold, and then start to look at the contribution of total distance based around anaerobic, potentially aerobic. And the alactic system, yes, it can jump in there, and we can have a high velocity that's alactic and it's not anaerobic. I know people are thinking that as I'm saying this, and that will create a little bit of error, but that's pretty negligible. I think it's going to be less than 1%, certainly for sports that go for a reasonable amount of time. Okay, so once you use up that alactic, that store, even in a football game, an American football game where it's stop-start and you have a capacity to rest and regenerate your alactic system, you're still not going to have large amounts of those concurrent plays be alactic. So I'm not too worried about that side of it. Certainly in continuous games like soccer and hockey and things like that, I think this comes into effect. And so you can either measure your point, your inflection point, or your anaerobic threshold point as an external velocity. I find the most practical way is the MASS method, the max aerobic speed method. I think it's really, really easy, and obviously there's maybe more detailed ways of doing it, but just running a player through an extended test where you're really sure that they're using mostly all their aerobic energy system, So a 5-minute run's a really common one, but there are equations that calculate it based on the beep test or the yo-yo test, these types of tests, anything that's all aerobic. We can then just divide the distance by the time, and that'll give us an average velocity for the test. And essentially, as long as the player or the athlete went as fast as they could aerobically, we're going to say that that's max aerobic speed, and really going to be really close to anaerobic threshold. So we can either measure it, but if you don't measure it for a runner, a decent team sport-based runner, somewhere around the 4 meters per second, 9 miles an hour, 14.4 meters per second, miles per hour, kilometers per hour, respectively, there is going to be reasonably close. That might be a slight underestimation. It might be slightly high for some team sport players that are decent runners, but if we're going to guess, it's going to be somewhere close to that. And this can be really useful for obviously measuring the load of a running player. So let's say a soccer midfielder. Okay, what was the contribution of today's session from an anaerobic perspective? So yes, from a loading perspective, that's important, but also from an intensity perspective. Okay, did we do enough? Okay, what is this drill designed the way we designed it, with a certain rest or whatever between drills? Is it achieving what we're thinking it is? Is it at a match intensity and trying to replicate that match intensity? And the good thing about percentage type in this scenario is that it's obviously a relative parameter. It takes time out of the equation. So you can run it for 5 minutes or 15 minutes, and a percentage will still hold true and be comparable between the two. So I really like it. I've used it in the past and had a really good. I looked at thousands of files to look at what's the the breakdown of anaerobic running for the very best players, and it was in a really small window. In Australian rules football, we found somewhere around the 30% mark of total distance that was done over 4 meters per second was a pretty good measure, and the truly elite players, truly elite midfielders, were up around the 35% mark. So you're going to find your own threshold or percentage that's going to be the benchmark. But I've used it a lot and really like the idea. So basically, we're just going to come back into this custom parameter creation section and call it whatever. So the best way is to come into your bands here and make sure your bands are set up to come close. One of them is going to come close to that threshold that you want. Now, of course, if you're doing it relative for certain players, if you did a test, a mass test, or a lactic threshold test, you're going to be able to individualize that for certain players. But if not, you can use global bands here. And we're just going to look at the band that sits at the threshold. So let's say, for my purposes, I want to use 4 meters per second as the threshold for these guys. So all we're going to do is we're going to add up 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 and divide it by total distance. Call it whatever you want. So we can go in here, equals, open bracket, $, for, we want distance. We can just copy that. Say 4, 5, 6, 8, and divided by total distance. And that's that's a simple measure. If you want it in a true percentage number, you can times by 100, of course, and numbers work just fine in this equation process. So that's a parameter that I've used in the past extensively, and I really like it. I think it's worthwhile using. So time relative parameters, we've already sort of touched on a little bit, but you can bring up different time metrics within the custom parameter creation window, and so it might be just even metrics that you already use. Some of those custom parameters that we used, we can just simply divide by the minutes of the session, and that can give you a relative measure. So it might be total IMAs in all directions. So you want to look at it in total, but you also want to look at total IMAs per minute. Or you might want to look at it in per 6 minutes. So you have the parameter per minute times 6. I know there might be a good way of looking at a general guide of a per on-field rotation, per rotation sort of interval, or whatever it might be. You might decide that a play is a certain, or a stint on the field, a drive is a certain length, and you can customize it around that. But a really good reason to do time relative or any kind of relative parameter is that it becomes more comparable. So if a player plays 40 minutes of game time versus 25 minutes of game time, their total player load isn't comparable. A lot of their parameters aren't comparable because obviously one player just simply spent more time, and that's why they built up certain metrics. But if we want to start to have a look at the effectiveness of a player, saying, okay, we have a certain amount of player load, but do we have the same proportion of high intensity movements, or is that player becoming less effective as he plays longer? These types of things are good ideas to divide by the time. You can also divide by other metrics, other load metrics like total player load or total distance, and that will start to give us a bit of a gauge on how many intense movements, high velocity running, all those sorts of things. How much is a player doing that based on their total load? So does that drop off or remain steady as their load increases, or as we get into the 5, 6, 7, 800 player load range in a practice, is that player's ratio of high intensity movements per player load or total load, is it dropping off, or is it remaining the same? And it can be a good way of understanding whether a player, how well a player or an athlete deals with an increasing load. So whether it be total IMAs divided by player load, total high velocity distance, or total accelerations divided by total distance or player load, that ratio, as we start to see load increase, do we see the ratio remain the same? Or when we get into those really high player load days or events or OTAs or spring ball, these sorts of things, when we're training the players hard, as we increase them heavily, do they drop off? In basketball, maybe really the top category of high jumps, when we start to increase the load, do they drop down into that medium category because of fatigue, because of inability, because of whatever? Can be a good idea of how much can we push a player before their performance starts to drop off, and that can be a flag of how much they can take, because as we know, different players may deal with a 700 player load differently. A senior versus a freshman, all these, a rookie versus a veteran, these types of thoughts. So that's all I have for today's webinar. Hopefully it's been somewhat beneficial and thought-provoking. There's lots more custom metrics that are used around different sports, and if you're interested in starting to do custom metrics, please reach out to one of the applied sports scientists here. If you're already using custom metrics and want some more different ideas around how can we start to manipulate the data and combine some different things together to create a different look at what's happening, also please reach out to one of the applied sports scientists here, and we'll be happy to answer any questions or walk you through what might be specific to your program. Thanks for watching, and all the best with Catapult.